Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our presentation tonight. I am Chrissy, and I'm with the Friends of Netarts Bay Watershed Estuary Beach and Sea, which we like to affectionately abbreviate to WEBS. WEBS is a small nonprofit organization which is primarily supported by passionate volunteers that work to sustain the Netarts Bay area through education and stewardship. We work really hard to bring great education opportunities to the community, like we're doing tonight with our presentation on resilient landscapes. But we also work really hard to bring education to our youth, and we support a variety of school programs as well. We want to bring this to the community for free so that we can reduce barriers to access. And so we work hard to fundraise through grants and private donations to do this type of work. We're really excited to bring resilient landscapes to you today, with forest fire being a kind of a topic that we've all thought about over this last year, and even coming close to home here in Tillamook. We felt like it was a really great topic to bring to the community to help people learn a little bit more about the role of wildfires in our forested areas. And so I'm super excited to bring this to you tonight. Before I hand it over to our speaker, I did just kind of want to go over a little bit of logistics. Here with us tonight is one of our board members, Nancy, and I'm sure Nancy will turn on her camera in a second and wave to you. Nancy and I will be helping to manage this presentation behind the scenes. There's Nancy. Hi, Nancy. We just want to remind you that this is being recorded, and it's also being broadcast live to Facebook. So if you wish not to be recorded and on social media for the existence of this video, then please do make sure you keep your video off and keep yourself muted. We do want to hear your questions. We're going to ask that you save your questions to the end, but as they pop into your brain, feel free to just put them in the chat, and then we'll feed them to our presenter at the end of the presentation. So I did want to take a moment just to present or tell you a little bit about our speaker. Elena Lawson she is the director of Unbridled Conservation Outreach. Elena has always had a passion for outreach and community engagement, and found that translating science into different formats to reach a wide variety of audience members was her calling. And after getting her degree in fisheries and wildlife from Oregon State University, she gained field experience working on wildfire-related research. And in learning about wildfire, realized that educating others on this topic was highly important. Unbridled Conservation Outreach was started because of this, and created during the time of COVID to create friendly outreach materials on wildfire, as well as other conservation topics, and to make them accessible to all. And so I'm going to stop sharing and let Elena start sharing her presentation, and just welcome her to tonight's event. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to put this together.
Thank you, Chrissy, for having me today. As Chrissy mentioned, I'm the director at Unbridled Conservation Outreach. We're an Oregon-based nonprofit that focuses on putting together outreach material on a variety of topics, including wildfire, which is where we started. I'm very excited to bring you this presentation today. The format of this talk is going to be me talking over video that I have taken while walking through several of Oregon's wildfires. The first video that you will see will be from the Eagle Creek Fire that burned in the Gorge in 2017. That will lead into the Riverside Fire that burned in Estacada in 2020. And then we will be emphasizing Tillamook's past and current relationship with wildfire, and taking a look at the Pike Fire, which burned in 2020. With that said, I'm going to share my screen. Moment. I'm going to turn off my video. Okay, great. After this past year, I think the majority of us can say that wildfire has touched our lives in some way, shape, or form. And before I get started, I just wanted to share my personal story from this past year so that you understand that I am coming from this, from the perspective of an empathetic person. because this past year did take a toll on me as well. This photo was taken at the base of our road in the middle of the day. I think we can all say that this is a site that we never want to see again in our lifetime. My husband and I live in Canby, and we're about 20 minutes from the fire line in Molalla. I board my horse in Oregon City, and the Riverside Fire burned just a few miles up the road from him. I was one of the people that relied on others to evacuate my horse from that area, and I can honestly say that was probably one of the most stressful days of my life. The feeling of helplessness and the needing to rely on others to evacuate something that's so precious to you is an indescribable feeling. I'm forever grateful for the kindness that was shown to me that day. I spent the days following at the barn he was housed at, volunteering because they housed, I believe, around 100 displaced horses. Meanwhile, my husband helped volunteer at the fire line in Molalla to create a fire break. The group he was with was affectionately nicknamed the Redneck Fire Crew and is largely credited with saving the neighborhood they were near. Every morning when we would leave, I would pack up my car with my dogs and a suitcase full of irreplaceable photographs, not knowing if we would get back later that day to our house. Thankfully, it didn't come to that, and we were able to remain in our house. We only ever got to stage 2 evacuation. I'm a big believer that knowledge is power, and in learning and educating others about wildfire, I have gained a sense of peace following this past year. I hope after this talk, I can give you the same. Before I dive into this, I would like to define some terms that I will be using throughout the presentation. This first term is fire regime. This refers to the general pattern of natural wildfires that occurs in an ecosystem over a long period of time. This image here is from the USDA Fire Sciences Labs and shows a picture of fire regimes across the US. The second term I would like to define is secondary succession, which refers to the reestablishment of an ecosystem after a major disturbance, such as a wildfire. This image depicts how a forest would recover after a higher severity burn removed the understory and canopy of the forest. You can see here, after just a year, we would see annual plants return, but it would take several years before we would see trees come back to the area. With that said, let's start our walk through some of Oregon's wildfires. So this is the Eagle Creek Fire. I took this video in March this year. Unfortunately, like many wildfires, this fire was started as the result of human error when a teenager threw a firecracker into the forest in September during prime fire season. It burned around 50,000 acres in an area that is greatly beloved by many Oregonians. I remember this year particularly well because we had such bad air quality for about a month, and I kept trying to remember if that was normal or not from my childhood. I was in college at the time, and I had several friends from out of state who kept asking me if this was normal, and I had a very difficult time remembering if it was or not. Where I'm walking here is part of the Pacific Crest Trail, and it's a place that you yourselves can visit. I'd encourage you to go visit, especially if you were touched by the wildfires this past year. It has only been a few years post-fire, and already the forest is teeming with life. It gave me hope of what's to come and is now one of my favorite places to visit. When taking a look at the history of wildfire on our landscape, it becomes clear that fire has been around for an incredibly long time. For hundreds of millions of years, wildfire has served as an important creator of habitat, regulator of plant species, and fertilizer of soils. As plant communities grew and evolved, fire regimes evolved in response. In these ecosystems, it became not a question of if a wildfire would occur, but when. This question of when is actually somewhat predictable and varies depending on the fire regime and ultimately the climate of the area. The average amount of years between fires in a specific fire regime is called the fire return interval. For example, in eastern and southern Oregon, which have very dry, hot summers, we would expect to see wildfires more frequently compared to our Coast Range, which is a damp temperate rainforest. Scientists have actually been able to create estimates for that return interval of wildfires in these areas in Eastern Oregon being as little as 10 years between fires, and areas in our Coast Range spanning up to 400 years between fires. Fire regimes are a balance and rely heavily on the predictability of wildfire. Fires that are more frequent than they were historically in an area will wipe out species before they have time to grow and reproduce. Fires too infrequent will leave fire-tolerant plants to get crowded out by species that would have otherwise been tamed by fire. In other words, from an ecosystem health perspective, wildfire is a necessary and key component to ecosystem health, and that fact is reflected in plant communities' adaptations to wildfire. Plant adaptations to wildfire are probably one of my favorite topics because it is fascinating and amazing how species evolve. My favorite plant adaptation to wildfire is below ground growth buds. I have some video during this presentation that is labeled, so keep an eye out for that. This is a plant adaptation that can be seen in many of our maples here in Oregon. These below ground growth beds are sheltered during a fire, and oftentimes what seems to be a burned tree might still be alive. I think that this is my favorite fire adaptation because it gives instant hope following a wildfire. It is thanks to this that we see many of our big leaf maples in the Eagle Creek fire returning and thriving. Lots of Oregon's hardwood trees and shrubs have this adaptation as well. I have to apologize because you can't actually see the big leaf maples in this video, unfortunately, because it was March and the deciduous trees were still recovering from winter. So if you go back in the summer, you will see this, I promise. Another interesting plant adaptation to wildfire are serotoninous cones. These are cones that are enclosed in a resin and remain on trees for years until a wildfire comes through. The heat from the fire melts the resin and the cones are able to release their seeds. Some species of tree have both serotinous and regular cones just to cover their bases. Some species of plants not only have adaptations to help survive a wildfire, but rely on wildfire to grow and thrive. One of these species that can be found all over Oregon is the Morel mushroom. Morels are a highly sought after and high market value mushroom that seems to have a tight-knit relationship with wildfire. Growing up, my dad always took me during the spring to areas that had previously burned to hunt for this delicacy. At the time, I didn't think much about the correlation between the two, but rather just thought of this as a fact. If you want to find morels, go to past wildfires. What's fascinating is that Native Americans knew of this correlation and prescribed burns to encourage their growth. What's really interesting is that scientists aren't quite sure of the relationship, why this relationship occurs, and it is only with some types of morels. Now I would like to touch on how wildfire impacts our landscape. I'm not sure if you heard the term creates a mosaic pattern talked about in relation to the fires nearest you. For some reason, this term was always difficult for me to grasp, so let me explain it in a way that makes sense. In my head, I often viewed wildfires as moving in this all-consuming wall of flames. It turns out that it's not that simple or as scary. How wildfire moves depends on a variety of factors, such as wind speed and direction, and the amount of and type of fuel present. Fuel referring to the type of plant matter present that would burn in a fire. For the most part, we will see wildfires burn in patches and at different severities across the landscape. In some areas, it will burn incredibly hot and will remove both the understory and canopy of a forest, while in others, it will only burn the undergrowth, and in others still, it might not burn at all. This variation, if looking at the landscape from a top-down perspective, resembles a piece of mosaic art, hence the term. This mosaic pattern is incredibly important when it comes to reestablishing an ecosystem and habitat creation. In this video, if you can see that part of the canopy is still intact, and this is a great example of what I'm referring to when talking about the mosaic pattern. And yes, I did say previously, habitat creation. The idea that wildfire can actually create important habitat for wildlife is incredibly counterintuitive, especially after seeing all of the photos of the displaced deer in the middle of the road staring at the fire. It is hard to believe that wildfires can be beneficial to that very same deer. This is because in the years following the fire, the understory and ideal plants for grazing will thrive due to a lack of canopy that used to prevent sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Research has also shown that deer and elk might prefer grazing in recently burned areas due to increased predator visibility. The standing dead trees that will remain will serve as habitat for cavity nesters, such as owls and woodpeckers, and the downed woody debris is used as cover by small mammals and reptiles. As I mentioned, the mosaic pattern is also helpful when reestablishing the ecosystem. Trees and plants that did not burn will grow to reproduce and reseed the burned areas as well, and provide cover and habitat for animals that prefer undisturbed areas. Now that I have given you a quick overview of wildfire, let's talk about the history of wildfire in the Tillamook area specifically. When I drive down Highway 6 from the Portland area to Tillamook, I cannot help but admire the beauty of the forest. What's even more remarkable is that the forest is man-made, hand-planted, and deeply rooted in the history of wildfire in the area. I must apologize because unfortunately I do not have footage from the Tillamook forest, so please continue to enjoy the Eagle Creek fire. This video will feed into some footage from the Riverside Fire in Estacada that burned this past year as well. The history of wildfire in Tillamook is a fascinating and unique story. On August 14, 1933, a wildfire broke out during routine logging operations. What would have been a small wildfire under mild wind conditions was magnified when a similar wind event that occurred in 2020 happened, feeding the blaze. This wind created a seemingly unstoppable force, and despite a massive firefighting effort, the fire burned until September when it was finally put out by rain. Following the first fire came two more in 1939 and 1945. This reoccurrence of wildfires became known as the 6-year jinx and created 400 square miles of scorched ground where areas had burned and reburned, leaving no mosaic pattern on the landscape. After the 1945 fire, fire crews went to work creating fire corridors and access roads in an attempt to be proactive about fighting future fires. In 1951, a new fire broke out. This fire was a true testament to the level of preparedness that was now in place and was quickly put under control. After the 1951 fire, a massive replanting effort ensued that spanned 2 decades. School buses full of children were brought in to plant thousands of seedlings. Elk and deer were very pleased by the planting efforts and followed the volunteers around, happily eating them, the seedlings. Helicopters were used to spread seeds over the burned areas as well. Many people during this time did not believe they would see a forest again in their lifetime, and yet now we have the Tillamook State Forest standing. If you are interested in learning more about the Tillamook burns, the Tillamook Forest Center and the book The Tillamook by Gail Wells are great resources. This is a very bare bones version of a complicated and fascinating story that could be its own separate talk. Now that we've discussed Tillamook's past, let's dive into the present. I am just a tad bit ahead of my video, so I am going to fast forward. Oh, this is some video of the below ground growth beds from the Riverside Fire in Estacada. I was really excited about this because I went in January and it burned in September, so it hadn't been very long. It was also winter, so I wasn't expecting to see very much new growth, and this kind of just made my day. It was really emotional walking through this area, actually. I had a really hard time just because it had been so recent, but this just made my day. Anyways, let's talk about the Pike Fire. Now we're going to take a look at the Pike Fire, which started on Monday, September 7th of 2020. The fire started at the base of this utility pole when a power line was struck down due to a strong wind. You can see in the video just how close the point of origin for the fire was to the homes in the area. I would estimate maybe 200 yards, but I'm not very good at estimating distances. So if someone has a more precise measurement, please feel free to drop it in the comments and I will circle back to that later. Anyways, it is truly a testament to the massive firefighting efforts, both from firefighters and community members, that those houses are still standing. What's remarkable is that even though those homes were surrounded by flames, only one structure was lost, and that was an outbuilding. I'd like to take a moment to thank the property owners for allowing me to take video around their property and share a small part of their story. I'd also like to remind those listening that the Pike Fire burned a total of 301 acres only on private property, and this would not be a place to go visit. This is a hillside near one of the homes that was closer to the point of origin of the fire. This hillside burned incredibly hot, and there was concern about erosion. The logs you can see that are placed horizontally on the hillside were put there for erosion control. And you can see seedlings marked by the flagging tape that were planted also in an attempt to control the erosion. The strong wind that started the Pike Fire was a similar wind event to the one that started the Tillamook burns all those years ago. But in 2020, the community was prepared to protect human lives and property from the fire. Each home in the area had its own fire crew protecting it, and even as the fire seemingly surrounded the homes, the fire crew stayed. Meanwhile, loggers teamed up to create access roads and fire breaks in an attempt to contain the quickly spreading fire. Firefighters do not have the equipment necessary to create roads that quickly, and is largely because of these volunteer loggers that the fire was so quickly contained. I'm walking on some of these roads that were created here that have since been seeded with grass. Homeowners returned to our homes after with a mixture of overwhelming emotions, feeling incredibly thankful to have their homes still standing and grieving the loss of forest that once surrounded them. One thing to note is that this fire burned incredibly hot surrounding the homes closest to the point of origin, as I showed you in that video previously. This is in part due to human planting efforts in that area that overplanted trees. These trees grew in such close proximity that many of the lower branches were dead, making them prime fuel for fire. Instead of having a more natural landscape that would burn here and there, the fire burned intensely and spread to almost all the surrounding trees. Without that root system to stabilize the slope, this left several slopes surrounding homes particularly vulnerable to erosion and potential landslides. Erosion following wildfires is a natural process and can actually create new and different habitats in creek beds. However, the level of management needed following a wildfire is proportional to the amount of human presence on the landscape. With that said, I think it's important to note that we as people are part of the ecosystem. Taking a holistic approach to conservation and land management is really important following a disturbance. Management practices are often a big picture trade-off between practices that are ecologically beneficial and those that protect human investments. This would be my dog Goose making a guest appearance. In the case of the Pike Fire, erosion control is a main management focus, not only for the case of the property owners that were directly impacted, but also for the farm owners in the valley below. Murphy's Creek, which runs through the burned area, is only 6 inches above sea level. As sediment runs off the hillside and into the creek, it raises the creek bed. This could potentially cause flooding to the farmland below and cause a loss of income for the Tillamook community. So what can be done to prevent this? A huge replanting effort has been underway to reestablish a healthy root system and hold the soil and sediment in place. Grass seed, I believe blue wild rye, has been spread, and native trees that have been donated by Stimson Lumber have been planted in the areas that were left particularly vulnerable. This replanting also gives the homeowners something more immediate to look forward to, as if left to secondary succession, it would take many years for trees to come back to the area. I feel it is important to note that if a wildfire happened in your area, that our forests are equipped to return after a wildfire on their own. Replanting is an excellent management tool and a necessary one in areas that are left particularly vulnerable, but it is unnecessary in a lot of areas. We see this when looking at other areas of the Pike Fire. What is really interesting about the Pike Fire is that while on one side it burned particularly hot, on the other side it burned at a lower severity. In this part of the forest, it consists of deciduous trees that establish the area from encroaching in. This area of the forest was logged twice, once in the 30s and once in the 50s, and never replanted. Although originally the forest consisted of conifers, the current deciduous forest is all native species and again was not hand planted. Because of this, the trees are spaced nicely apart and the forest floor consisted of a nice understory. When the fire burned through this area, it was not as hot and it left many trees alive. You can already see the understory starting to come back this spring. And you can kind of see that in some of this video here, the little patches of green on the hillside. Oh, here's some growth buds again. This is in that same area, the area that burned not as hot. The trees are already coming back. And here you can see some canopy remains. I think that the Pike Fire is a good example that not all wildfires are the same, and that even in a relatively small fire, you can have such different landscapes burn and different post-fire management, depending on the location within the fire. With that said, if you would like to get involved in assisting with management efforts post-fire, I would encourage you to contact local nonprofits near you that might be looking for volunteers. In the case of the Pike Fire, the Tillamook Watershed Council has been leading the efforts, and I am sure they would be happy to have some extra hands. This video, I think, is really wonderful because you can really see the green contrast with the brown and black, the green being the plants coming back this spring at the Pike Fire. Now I'm going to talk briefly about some fire preparedness. Human to wildfire interfaces are often, unfortunately, at odds with one another. As forests grow with the anticipation of wildfire in these fire regimes, the question that remains is, what can we as people do to work in harmony with the ecosystem and protect our homes? The answer is because wildfire is not this all-consuming wall of flames. There are things we can do to ensure our homes remain intact. The first thing you can do is evaluate your home's ignition potential. I realize this sounds very doomsday-ish, but it's much better to do this now rather than wait until when we are in next fire season. This image is from the Firewise program and breaks up preparing your home and personal property into distances and different zones. The immediate zone, which is this red here, is within 5 feet of your home and should be the first place that you start. Research has shown that high intensity flames within 100 feet of a home are mostly incapable of igniting a house directly. It is going to be falling embers that are going to put your home at risk. When evaluating your home, you want to look at potential fuel sources surrounding your house. Things like dead leaves, dry bushes, and pine needles that accumulate around the base of your house are going to ignite readily from those falling embers. It is important to keep your rain gutters clean, even during the dry season, and have a clean roof free of leaf debris. You can also install mesh screens to attic vents and make sure that window screens are not loose and are intact. The intermediate zone, which is this orange box, is within 5 to 30 feet of your home. And this is the area that you should pay attention to next. In this area, you are going to be looking at your landscaping and overall property appearance. Create fire breaks around roads, driveways, patios, and decks. Plant shrubs and trees in small clusters spaced apart and in a way to ensure that mature growth will not be within 10 feet of a structure. Keep your lawn mowed and grass cuttings picked up as well. The extended zone, which is this green box, yeah, that's green, is within 30 to 150 feet from your home. And is the last area to be addressed. In this area, we are focusing on disrupting a fire's path and intensity. In this area, you can look at tree spacing in particular, and the Firewise website has some very specific suggestions around measurements. Your local fire department should also have some great resources available regarding your specific area. And I'm going to turn my video back on. This concludes my presentation for today. I would really like to thank Chrissy and the Friends of Netarts Bay for having me, as well as Claire Thompson with the Tillamook Watershed Council, who was kind enough to show me around the Pike Fire multiple times. I would also like to thank the Welches, who are one of the homeowners in the area, for sharing their story with me. Denise Berkshire with Oregon Department of Forestry, and Travis Corby, maybe, with Oregon State Parks for helping teach me about Tillamook's history with wildfire, and my board member and friend and fire ecologist, Dr. Lisa Ellsworth, as well. And that is all I have for you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really great footage and great information to share. I invite anybody that's on the call right now or joining us via Zoom or via Facebook Live to go ahead and just chat any question that you have, and we will feed that to Elena so she can answer those questions. And we'll get that to you. I do want to note that in the chat, we do have somebody from Oregon State University Extension, and they did post a series of events that are coming up to help people be prepared for wildfire and the wildfire season. And I did click on the link. There's a lot of great information there and a series of dates that have been shared as an opportunity for the community to learn more about how they can be prepared and about fire. That was really great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I do have one question coming in from one of our web's board members, actually. Can you suggest a resource for fire-resistant plants for landscaping?
This is a really good question. The Firewise website has a wealth of information. I would suggest starting there. Otherwise, I'm not sure, but I can ask and get you some resources as well.
Great. It looks like there is another resource sent out in the comments too, so that's great. The next question I see is, it says, in an intermediate zone, is it useful and important to have trees as a fire barrier? If so, how far and what species?
Let me pull up that image. So in the intermediate zone, and I have to apologize because I got all of my information from Firewise website. I would not necessarily classify myself as a fire preparedness expert, but it talks mostly about spacing. So it talks about planting things in clusters and spaced apart, and there is a specific spacing that they recommend, and I honestly couldn't tell you if it was 6 to 10 feet apart, but it didn't mention anything about specific species. I think that probably is because it's dependent on your area. But I would start there and go from there as far as finding out more information on that.
Great. Great. I do want to say, while we're waiting for a couple more questions to come in, a big thank you to Tillamook Bay Watershed Council for, like, I really appreciated that you added that in the beginning. I didn't give the due credit to Tillamook Bay Watershed Council for their help with this presentation. And Elena came out of her way to come up and tour these areas, and Claire Thomas helped us take her through these areas to kind of get a little bit more of a picture of what was happening here locally. So big thanks to them. I know Claire's on the call, so Claire, if you have any volunteer needs coming up, you can certainly, you have a captive audience here that's really interested in fire, so definitely add any volunteer needs you might have, just chat it in, and or see if we can recruit some people to your cause there. So
can I speak right now?
Sure.
On Sunday at 1 o'clock, the Watershed Council is hosting a final plant of a spring area on Vaughn Creek up Pike Road. So if you go to Bay City and look for Pike Road on your GPS, it's just at the end of Pike Road there on the right-hand side. It's the very last area we're planting, and we're doing that on Sunday, but you can have a chance to see a lot of the different areas that were probably talked about on this video. Didn't get in at the very beginning. I was having problems on my iPad, but anyway. So yeah, that'll be Sunday, this coming Sunday after church for me at 1 o'clock on Pike Fire off Bond Creek. Park Road off Bond Creek.
Great. Claire, if anybody has questions, do you want me to put your email in the chat so they can get a hold of you, or do you have another way?
No, that's a good way. Or if they want to call me on the phone, I'll just give the phone number right now.
I'll put it in the chat so everybody can get it.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Very good. And you'll do that. You already have
Yep.
it. So
I'll
okay.
handle it for you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. We do have another question. Why do you think we are increasingly seeing wildfires in Oregon? Is this anticipated based on the current regime?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure why we're seeing increased wildfires in Oregon, other than an obvious explanation is a shift in our climate. It's a really difficult question. I feel like in order to accurately answer this question, I need to get some more information on the topic and get back to you. Can you drop your email possibly, and then I can consult with my resident fire expert and get back to you.
Yeah, so just go ahead and you can privately message it to me if you want to as well. If you just so you don't share it with everybody, that's an option as well. Then we have another question. I'd love to go to the Pacific Crest Trail where you took some of your footage to see the after effect of the fire. Can you tell us how to get there?
Yes. So it's off 84. 84 is the road that goes out to the gorge. I parked by the Bridge of the Gods trailhead. And that's probably the easiest way to find it is if you Google Bridge of the Gods. When you get there, it's going to take you to a parking lot, and it's not going to look like there's a trailhead there. Walk across the street to the parking lot, and there it kind of takes off up this hillside. And it's a wonderful hike. Highly recommend spending quite a bit of time looking at the ground as well as what's around you, because especially this time of year with spring mushroom season, there is going to be some interesting finds. It's really wonderful. And if you want, I feel bad asking people to share their information over and over again, but if you would like, I can send you a map. I would need a way to get that to you.
If anybody would like that information, you can just email it directly to us, and I will get your information to Elena so she can send that your way. My email, I'll put it in the chat, but is director@neatartsbaywebs.org. And so I will certainly get you anything that you're interested in getting. Just send us an email and let us know what you're interested in. Let me see if Nancy, do you see anything coming in on Facebook? Just want to make sure we didn't.
No, I do not.
Okay, just scanning through here. I see something. You probably don't see it because it's come just to me. Can you speak to the difference in the fire we would see in somewhere in Eastern Oregon versus a fire that we would see here on the coast? I think you kind of talked about that earlier in presentation, but if you could just kind of revisit what those fires, how they would differ. There's something here about intensity. Would it be different?
This is a really good question. Sorry, these are all great questions. This one's hard because it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. I feel like they're very, very different for a number of reasons. One, in Eastern Oregon, we're going to see a lot more annuals and plants that are just already ready to grow and reproduce in a very short period of time. also in Eastern Oregon, you're battling things like invasive species, with cheatgrass creating this massive blanket for wildfire to travel that wasn't historically there. In our area, in our Coast Range, it's very damp generally, and it was actually damp this past year as well. So that's going to impact how fire moves. I feel like it's so hard because they're just very fundamentally different. In Eastern Oregon, we're going to see them more frequently. I believe it was a return interval of as little as 10 years. And in our Coast Range, it can span up to 400 years between fire. Plants in our area, when I say our area, I live in Canby, Oregon, so not that far from the Coast Range. Our trees are meant to take many, many, many years to reach a maturity. And there's fewer plants like that in Eastern Oregon. This is a very generic way to answer this question, but I guess it's just completely different. So right way to answer it.
Could I add a little bit?
Yeah.
This is Aaron Groth, OSU Extension Fire Specialist. I think that it's also important to understand that in terms of the kind of paleoecological record as well as the historic record for the Coast Range, it's important to keep in mind there are fires that were prior to the Tillamook Fire. I think that there's very little research that has been done and a major research gap that I hope the College of Forestry at OSU will close in upon in terms of actually documenting that fire history. I suspect in the case of the Willamette Valley, there are definitely anthropogenic fire landscapes. In the case of the Coast Range, the removal of Native Americans from the Willamette Valley, and then also the kind of successive periods of the reservations in the west of Western Oregon shrinking, being eliminated, and then eventually being reconstituted in some cases, although vastly diminished. I think that there's perhaps a cultural fire history that is missed. But in terms of the Westside Fire, generally speaking, depending on that return interval in Eastern Oregon, you might have some ground fires. You might have a more open woodland, whereas in the case of the Coast Range, generally the risk would be that you would have massive high energy stand replacing fires, which is what happened during Tillamook. And then if there's I think the extreme weather events are also really important. So when you have those strong easterlies, such as, I'm sorry, how do you pronounce your name? Elena, sorry. Oh, so Elena had mentioned the first burn of the Tillamook, although it was recurring burns every 6 years, because of those easterly winds during the first burn, the size of the wildfire increased in size 200,000 acres in a single day. So I think that in terms of our knowledge, having paleoecological data, historical record, there's more analysis that needs to be done. I hope that helped. Don't want to take away from our speaker. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you for taking the time to answer that. That's very helpful. Really, that helps with the person's question.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing and all your resources online too, in the chat. And we, there is some stories about older fires before the burn, which is what seems to kind of occupy most of our minds, is the Tillamook burns. But there are some stories and legacies, like Aaron alluded to, or just talking about, with fires predating those times. It's kind of an interesting story to start to dive into, and definitely seems to be gaps there. Next question is, if you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How many years should you allow post wildfire if you want to anticipate good places to find mushrooms?
That's a great question. So I don't know how to actually answer a question without preferencing how great it was before I answer it, apparently. For morels, it's hard because I wouldn't necessarily call myself an avid mushroom hunter. I grew up mushroom hunting, so all of what I know about mushroom hunting is very much from my dad. And so we would go right away. For morels, for the morels that have a close association with wildfire, you want to look in areas that burned that had conifer trees. I do know that. But we would go maybe the next spring following. I would be out this spring. Not now would be too early. The telltale sign for if it's ready for morel season is the, oh shoot, there's a flower. There's an Oregon flower. It has 3 white leaves. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's beautiful. Trillium?
Trillium? I have quite a few people coming in with Trillium.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
It sounds like Trillium.
Yes, I'm pretty sure. Yes, thank you, Trillium. And so once those are blooming, that is the time to go out to look for morels. So I do know that. As far as like how many years after a wildfire, I feel like we were out looking the year like of, or the year after. So this spring, I'd be out this spring.
Somebody, Lisa in the comments shared that they are up in the Willamette Valley. So.
Oh wow! So now maybe. I was thinking it might be too early, but yeah, I am very excited for mushroom season this year. I believe there are other types of mushrooms that also have close relationships with wildfire, but morels are the ones that I know of.
Great. Yeah, that I would certainly find. It's always fun to find them. And besides that, there's also a variety of other really lovely fungus that comes up in burned area as well, which is kind of fun just to check this out. It's not all about morels, even though we all like them. Just a note that says, are there potential overhead dangers that folks should be aware of if they are planning to tour recent burns?
Yes. I guess when you're going into an area that burned, I would pay attention to your surroundings. When I was walking through the Riverside Fire, I kind of felt like I should probably have a hard hat on, honestly, but I didn't. But yes, I think that there's dangers when you walk in the woods in general, but when you're walking through wildfire, there are standing dead trees, and there can be more widowmakers, which are the dead branches, than normal. So I would definitely pay attention to your surroundings and walk carefully.
Great. We do have one last question, and I don't know if you can see it in your comments. I'll let you kind of look over it. It's asking, are plantation style timberlands, things that are meant for 40-year harvest, any greater risk for forest fire than mature forests in the same region? So maybe kind of managed timberlands versus more old growth systems. So
yes, and I think so Lisa Ellsworth is on my board, and she is my resident fire expert, and she is going to answer that question.
Hi, this is Lisa. I'm also at Oregon State University. Yes, we do often see that there's higher risk, there's higher intensity fire in plantations as compared to natural old growth forests. The old growth trees are spaced much further apart, whereas plantation is often very dense. So especially in the first couple of decades after that plantation goes in, there's lots of small trees that are close together. So we do often see higher intensity fire come through there. There's also been some research that has shown that if you average out over everything, private lands typically do have greater fire severity, greater impacts of wildfire than public lands, and that's tied to those plantation management. So different lands have different management objectives, and the trade-off comes with some increased fire risk.
Great, thank you, Lisa, for sharing. So we'll give you a couple more questions here. So what's the forecast for the 2021 fire season in Oregon, and are forecasts generally accurate?
I do not know what the forecast is for the 2021 fire season in Oregon right now. Specifically, well, I don't know where it is anywhere in Oregon, but especially in our area, I know that's a concern for a lot of people following this last year. But I can ask.
Sounds good. Well, I want to make sure we didn't miss anything. I don't see Nancy chiming in, so I don't think we missed anything from Facebook. We didn't actually advertise that it would go live, so I'm not surprised that maybe we're not getting as many on there, which is totally okay.
We had Danny Stark, who agreed that the different areas are very different with different fire regimes and species composition. So more of a comment than a question.
Awesome. Thanks, Nancy. Well, I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I want to thank Elena for the amount of time that she put into this presentation and how much effort she put into trying to learn a little bit more about our area and what happened here, and bringing that to our community so that we could see and learn about what happened at that site, especially since it is private. And I also want to thank the Tillamook Bay Watershed Council one more time for the time that they gave us to helping us put this together. And I also want to note that this presentation was also part of the Explore Nature Partnership, which is 9 different nonprofits that have come together to offer natural resource and natural resource-based industry education opportunities that are typically in the field on the land. So you're experiencing it firsthand, understanding the importance of the natural resources in this area and the work that's going into preserving and conserving them for the future. If you want to learn more about Friends of Neatards Bay Webs, we encourage you to go to our website at www.neatardsbaywebs.org. I encourage you to put your organization's website in the chat before we log off, so everybody can also learn more about Unbridled Conservation and the work they're doing. We do have another presentation coming up. We are presenting Hybrid in a Haystack, and this is a presentation coming to you to talk about a new discovery of 2 beach grasses that are not native that have created a hybrid, and what that means for our dune habitats, as well as what that means for the species that live in our dune habitats, like the snowy plover. So if you would like to join us for that, the registration link is open and it's on April 22nd. I did forget to also note that we have another presentation in May on sharks of the Oregon coast. So that one is also live and active on our website as well. If questions are still percolating for you on this after the program, please feel free to email them to us. I'm happy to forward them on to Elena so that we can get them answered. I'm also happy to share, if you're interested in a map or any of the resources that she talked about on this presentation, I'm happy to help you get in touch so that you can get those resources as well. But I just want to thank you all for coming and welcome you to stay engaged with all of the organizations that took part in tonight's presentation. And just a big thanks to you, Elena. I know how much time you put into this, so I really appreciate you joining us for tonight's call.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet, you bet. All right, well, I hope everybody has a wonderful sunny evening, and we'll look for you at one of our next virtual programs, or fingers crossed, come July, potentially in person. Thanks so much, and please do stay in touch and forward your questions on to us. All right, good night, everybody.